As with any large enough community, Avatar 2 has a number of subjects and takes that are very well known to be quite taboo. You know, minor things like The Great Divide actually being a solid episode and Aang lying really isn't that big of a deal. The question of, is Avatar anime? The question of, could Iroh defeat Ozai? And even the long-forgotten and forbidden knowledge. Mike and Brian being involved with the entire creation of the movie that shall not be named. Give it a few months and you'll see all of these talking points brought up in some capacity over and over. But one that I never thought would be controversial in any way is filler in Avatar. Unfortunately, I think filler is one of those things that, in online discourse, has been extremely overgeneralized and just twisted to mean something unnecessary and something bad. Normally, it'd be no big deal. I mean, who cares about some randos, myself included, screaming on the internet? But the concerning part is that I feel like this hyperfixation on removing anything that could even be seen as filler has already bled into very real productions, Avatar included, and I think we are now seeing the negative ramifications of that. But before we get to talking about Avatar, I think it's very important to define what this term, filler, even is. As much as people claim that Avatar is in fact not an anime, they really like to use the generally accepted anime adaptation meaning of filler. Okay, I joke about anime, but when it comes to adaptations, usually the word filler is used to describe anything that has been added for the adaptation that was not in the source material. This takes many different forms, from a few added lines of dialogue to entirely new characters and stories and everything in between. But you know, there's that little fact of Avatar not having any source material. Thing is, while filler nowadays is thrown around a lot in regard to adaptations, it is a purely production-centric term to describe the flow of an episode, movie, or music, or whatever else. Taken from good old Wikipedia, filler in television and other media is material that exists outside the story arc to pad out other material. As the term filler implies, its only purpose is to practically pad out the story and fill in the gaps so it's not just a to B story. Fundamentally, it has nothing to do with an adaptation. Though it's also important to note that in this context, filler is not so clearly defined as it would be with an adaptation. There, it is a very simple case of, is it in the source material? No? Okay, then it's filler. In this case, what is and isn't filler is sort of up for debate. For an extreme example, let us take the good old reliable Chekhov's gun. Put simply, from Chekhov's point of view, anything and everything that appears in a story must be relevant to its conclusion. If it is not, it should simply be cut. There is no filler, and absolutely everything that appears must come into play in some capacity. If a volcano doesn't erupt, it should have just been a mountain. If a gun is never fired, there should be no gun, hence Chekhov's gun, and so on. Again, this is an extreme, purely illustrative example that does not make a lot of sense, nor should be applied to a story like Avatar. But I'm gonna do it anyway. The Book 1 narrative is going to the north and mastering waterbending. Absolutely everything else surrounding that, under this definition, would be a degree of filler. And I say degree because things like Sozin's Comet are of course relevant, but there are other things that sort of show up, but they're not really important. With this line of thinking, you break the story down to its absolute bare bones, and it is a purely A to B story. So with that in mind, I think it's also important to talk about the different forms of filler we actually see. With anime, like I mentioned before, the most obvious one is just completely new, non-canon material. Depending on the story, it can be something as minor as just a throwaway beach episode, or it can be a full-blown filler arc like with One Piece for example. Most of the time, you can skip these outright and it's no big deal. By their very design, they are meant to be entirely modular and you can just slot them in wherever necessary. There is also a whole dimension to explore with these non-canon stories actually breaking canon, but that's a whole nother can of worms that is kind of irrelevant for the topic here. Point being that Avatar just by default doesn't have this. Another form of filler can be the purely practical concern of managing production times while still having a full season. Most of the time, this will be the obligatory recap episode where already existing animation is simply reused. It's super low budget, super low key, and just pads out the season. The single closest example to this in Avatar is the Guru. The whole chakra process is very cleverly hidden recap that repurposes existing animation. Keep this in mind for later. And the next closest thing is of course Ember Island Players, but while that is a recap episode, 100% of it is entirely new animation, so while it serves a filler Eve role, and even that is debatable because Book 3 is actually longer, because all of it is completely new, it just doesn't fit the practical concern we're talking about here, and it has character progression on top of that. We'll return to these in a little bit. Thing is, a lot of people might not like non-canon filler stories, a lot of people don't really like recap episodes, But what in my opinion is by miles the worst kind of filler is extremely bad canon filler. I've covered One Piece for a long time, so again let's use that as an example. Alongside the totally new filler arcs, there is also filler in the canon material. Because the anime can't catch up to the manga and the schedule for animation is just super tight, the existing material will be spread paper thin to fill up those 24 minutes. There'll be like a 3-minute previously on, then there's the opening, sometimes the episode itself will also open with more of the past episode, and the absolute worst of all, the material itself will also be drastically slowed down. Like a single panel of a lot of punches will be turned into a 2-minute long sequence and then there'll be repeated close-ups on the enemies, etc, etc. Most often, people will just call this a pacing issue, but it still falls under the same umbrella of just padding out the episode. All of those panning shots, all of those repeated sequences, all of that is pacing, yes, but that is filler. Which finally brings me onto the final form of filler. Something that takes place in the canon story, but something that is completely natural. The type of filler you could spend an hour debating whether or not it even is filler. If an episode provides some crucial characterization, but doesn't really have any lasting impact on the story, is that filler?
Hey, Vsauce! Michael here.
What about general world building? Most of it is not necessarily tied to the main plot, so what about that? The point I'm making here, and actually, you know what? No, let me just splice in Mike and Brian.
If there was an episode that didn't 100% move the overall plot forward, it was suddenly a filler episode. Forget that episode. And I was like, what is this filler? It's all part of the story, guys. Come on.
The reason why I think the term has been misconstrued is because I think filler only really becomes this almighty evil filler when it has clear flaws. The problem with it is not that it isn't important to the core plots, but rather that it is often just lazy and uninspired. In some cases, that is by design, as it is a purely production question. But other times, it's just plain bad. It will change how characters behave, sometimes even mess with the very rules of the world itself, and so on. And that is not a filler problem. That is a bad writing problem. Filler is not inherently good or inherently bad. It serves a very simple purpose of bridging two events, ideally in a way that feels natural and rewarding to follow. But alright, why am I even babbling on about all of this? There's bad filler and good filler that you can't even really call filler. Cool, but what does that have to do with anything? Well, what in my opinion is a very concerning trend nowadays is the industry taking a massive U-turn from stretching out episodes as much as humanly possible, think Lost, The Walking Dead, The Flash, even less narratively driven shows like 2.5 Men and The Old Sponge Lad, to now cutting any and all filler because the attention economy, if you will, has now shifted. I'm not going to be a boomer and go on a whole rant about how the tickety talks is rotting the brains of youths and screaming to think of the children. But attention spans and where people put that attention has absolutely shifted. There was a study done at the University of California where the researchers shadowed people in a range of different tasks and tracked how long they spent on a certain activity before switching to something else. Obviously, this is a purely observational study, so all the associated drawbacks are also there. But what they observed is that in 2003, attention spans averaged about 2.5 minutes on any screen before switching. Nowadays, that figure has fallen to roughly 47 seconds on a single screen. When looking at this in isolation, I don't think it's really that concerning. Most of the study relied on professional work, and yes, people are multitasking a lot more, which is not inherently bad. So yeah, 150-ish seconds to just 47 definitely looks bad, but it's not really the full picture. Problem is, this also coincides with average scenes of movies also becoming shorter and shorter. Certain studies have found that the average uninterrupted shots has decreased from 12-ish seconds in the 1930s to a very brisk 2.5 seconds nowadays. Others put it closer to 5 seconds nowadays, but point is, for a variety of reasons, both purely technological as well as behavioral, they are becoming shorter and shorter. And okay, we're on YouTube, so let's take YouTube itself. The meteoric rise of Mr. Beast and his production style bleeding all over YouTube, as well as the mind-boggling dominance of TikTok and Shorts in recent years, all reinforce this trend of faster media. Now more than ever, if you are not immediately satisfied in what you are seeing, you just swipe away and swipe and swipe and swipe until you find something good. It is a purely consumption-based type of media. All of this is to say that none of these trends indicate really anything in isolation, but you know what they say about multiple points and creating a line. Art is no longer just art. An equal, if not greater part of it is just pure behavioral science. In the same way that game developers aren't putting loot boxes in their game or blocking gameplay behind paywalls, a lot of what we see on our TVs is also purely driven by the streamer's retention analytics. So moving closer to Avatar, yes, we're still talking about that. Another thing you might notice is that when Netflix started producing their own series, their usual format was usually a 10-episode batch drop. Luckily for us, we can even take a show like Lucifer and directly compare how it operated on Fox versus Netflix. Obviously, it's not an entirely apples-to-apples comparison as it's a procedural drama and it was on Fox of all places, but it went from 18 to 20-ish episodes down to 10, down to effectively 8, even though the season was 16, just broken in half, and then 10 again. Usually you'd expect a first season of a show to be shorter for what I think are obvious reasons, both monetary as well as purely creative. But even though the story might be getting bigger in scope and garnering more success, Netflix has still stuck to their established format, and that is that. But wait, there's more. Because another odd development is that Netflix's own shows are also becoming shorter. Cowboy Bebop, Netflix's first big attempt at live-action anime, was 10 episodes, but didn't even cover all 26 of the anime episodes. But now both One Piece and Avatar only got 8, despite adapting 40-ish and 20 episodes respectively. And what's even more interesting is that we now know that a lot of the stuff people wanted to see was actually written, but was eventually cut when the episode count was reduced. Obviously, budgeting is a part of that question, but considering the overall pacing of even the calmer scenes, I think all of this once again just comes back to that hyperfixation of making things fast just to pump up those retention figures. Because Netflix drops entire seasons at once, they are effectively fighting for like 8 to 10 hours of your uninterrupted attention. That is very, very hard to do. And that's exactly why views, ratings, and everything else is secondary. The number one figure for Netflix is the completion of a show. The simplest way to diversify their portfolio, if you will, is to make shorter seasons that a larger number of people will complete, as opposed to spending more money on a 10-episode season only to have some people drop off at like episode 2, right? The upside of cutting things that might be seen as quote-unquote boring and getting people to the end is much, much better than the downside of them dropping the show. For, in my opinion, the most blatant Avatar example, let's look at Aang crying in the Southern Air Temple.
Huh?
So not to be rude, but...
That scene was written, filmed, and put in the episode, but what immediately sticks out to me is how quickly we cut away. We linger on Aang crying for all of 5 seconds before flashing forward, despite the next episode opening with us still being at the Southern Temple. Us abruptly cutting forward is not the director deciding to cut the scene short. That is the edit deliberately speeding things along. It is a deliberate decision not to leave this episode on a down note, despite the next one clearly opening with us still in the same location. But alright, once again, what does this have to do with filler and what does this have to do with Avatar? Well, like we talked about, filler is exactly that, filler. While I use Netflix since we have direct Avatar examples, and I think it's particularly noticeable with the binge model, I don't think this is just an issue with them. I think even HBO shows like The Last of Us and House of the Dragon could have done with a teeny bit more filler, but okay, this is not a video about that, so let us zero in on Avatar. And yes, I know House of the Dragon is technically based on an in-universe history book and a majority of the story is already written from scratch, so technically it is filler, but the first season should have been longer, don't at me. The simplest and most concise way I think I can describe the lack of filler in a story is the lack of texture and granularity. Technically speaking, yes, Haru and the Earthbenders are in no way relevant to the Season 1 narrative. Earthbending as a whole isn't really relevant, but it establishes a living, breathing world. Omashu might be standing proud, but there are also a whole lot of Earthbenders taken as prisoners of war. There's some who have just broken under the pressure. They fear the Fire Nation so much that they go as far as to rat out their own neighbors. It's a small part of additional context that later ties into the headband and all the propaganda we see in the Fire Nation schools, that then explains how this tyrannical nation has remained in power and slowly but surely whittled down any and all resistance. It is show don't tell at its most basic. This is a war. We've been told that the Firebenders bulldozed just about everything. But it's in this episode that we actually see how it impacts just regular people trying to get by. What about the pirates? Their only real purpose is to facilitate Katara getting the scroll, right? But no, because it is again a matter of adding depth to the characters and the world. Katara can break rules, and she can also be extremely stubborn and lash out. But we also know that all of that is purely an emotional reaction because of her connection to her mother. Waterbending made her feel closer to her, so Aang leapfrogging her progress just hits a nerve. And that's the thing, these characteristics are not really important to the quote-unquote core plot. But without them, the emotional connection to Katara we have as the audience is extremely diminished. I don't think it's anything groundbreaking to say that the more time we spend with the characters and the more sides we see of them, the more invested we become in their stories, right? I mean, I think everyone liked Iroh and knew that he was not an enemy very early on. But it's the tales of Ba Sing Se that elevate Lake Laogai and eventually Zuko and Iroh's reunion in Book 3. We already knew that Iroh clearly cares for Zuko, and we also heard of tangential information about Iroh stepping down from the war. But it's in this extremely up-close and personal filler bit of story that we truly see the reason for that. But okay, returning to the pirates, much like the Earth Kingdom citizens, it is again a matter of world building. In a world where the Fire Nation is gradually absorbing, well, the rest of the world, it makes perfect sense that these groups of non-benders would just go rogue and turn to good old piracy. Sure, it might not be crucial to Aang beating Ozai, but it shows us that in this world, there are these isolated groups with no concrete allegiances to any of the nations. Think of the Freedom Fighters, the Swamp Benders, Sparky Boom Man, and a number of others. And in the same vein, it also depicts that restoring balance angle that the series is all about. Yes, beating Ozai will defeat the Fire Nation, but the world itself would still reel from the past century of destruction. Removing all of those little side stories simply removes depth from the story. Even episodes like The Fortune Teller. An overwhelming majority of it is just random shenanigans with, as the name implies, the Fortune Teller. But underneath that, we see how Sokka sees the world and his place within Team Avatar. He doesn't believe in any prophecies, he doesn't believe in any cloud readings or destinies or whatever else. As we later see with his master, he considers himself as just normal.
Each of you is so amazing and so special. I'm just the guy in the group who's regular.
He is not a bender, he isn't destined to save the world like Aang, and he wasn't born a legendary warrior. And so what he does is fights for every bit of respect. He quite literally forges his own metal. Once again, the Fortune Teller is in no way necessary for that, nor is it necessary for reaching the North, nor is it necessary for beating Ozai. But it creates depth and a connective thread to make Sokka's journey a journey. The point I'm getting at is that both for totally new stories as well as adaptations, streamlining the narrative and cutting the fat just to get to the climax will undermine that big climax. No spoilers, but think of the Fly episode in Breaking Bad. A majority of it is blatant filler, and watching it in isolation is not very exciting. But when you zoom out and see the overarching paranoia in that entire arc, it is a value add to the overall story, even if it by itself is sorta mediocre by Breaking Bad standards. I suspect some of you will have already written this, but it's because of the overall story that you can say, but wait, The Fly is actually not that bad. You can look at that filler and draw value from it even though it, again by itself, is sorta boring. It's that big picture kind of vision that I think is vital for managing a story with meaningful depth. These are not just tragic backstories for the sake of tragic backstories. Each and every one of these side adventures connects to the characters' decisions we see for the entire remainder of the Avatar story. So with that in mind, I think it's worth briefly lingering on some of Avatar's best quote-unquote filler to really illustrate how important some of those unimportant stories are. First and foremost, at the very heart of the story is a magic system based on martial arts, so let us talk about just some very basic training.
Not magic, airbending.
Come on, Aang, I'm already making a video about defining things. Magic systems is an umbrella term for in-universe power mechanics. Bending isn't magic, but it is a magic system, okay, Aang? Sorry. Anyway, you'll probably notice that Aang or Katara or whoever else practicing are often used as transitionary or establishing scenes. One obvious example is the waterbending scroll where that is the entire inciting event for the episode. And it is also later the bridge when we get to the whole pirate conflict. Purely plot-wise, Aang waterbending really changes nothing until they reach the north and he begins to properly train. But in the story as a whole, it adds another layer to Aang starting to chip away at what would traditionally take many years. He needs to learn the elements. It might not be important to the story right now, but it is important to the overall story. As of right now, it simply adds depth to the world itself and Aang as a character. And of course, there's the whole Katara story here too, which creates a unique conflict between the gang as well as within Katara herself. Closer to the end of the series, we have episodes like Nightmares and Daydreams, where Aang's training becomes the core conduit for exploring his insecurity and fear. Again, we already know that he is afraid of confronting the Fire Lord and that he is afraid of being the Avatar in general. So functionally, it doesn't add a ton of new information, but it allows us to really dive deeper into Aang's psyche, not through some over-the-top monologue, but through a different form of conflict, in this case, insomnia. The first part of the finale opens with Aang just drilling firebending forms over and over, and the primary conflict there is a unique spin of what we've seen before, with Zuko deciding that tough love is the best way of teaching, as well as the whole discussions around what to do with Ozai. I guess the quickest way to get my point across is what we actually see in the Boiling Rock. Aang's training is just a small throwaway bit as we see Zuko and Sokka set off.
One more thing. Aang, practice your firebending while I'm gone.
None of these are fundamental pillars of the story. If you skip these episodes entirely, you'd still get the big picture just fine. But all of these little bits of bending and training is about creating a sense of permanence in this fictional world. Bending is not a checklist of chores. It is a constant thing that we occasionally touch base with, but it is always happening in the background. Whenever we see Aang hanging around water, chances are they're practicing. If anything, the episodes focused solely on learning new elements or techniques or something like that would actually benefit from more filler. Due to the limitations of the format, Aang does sometimes tend to learn a whole lot in a single afternoon, you know. And speaking of which, let us return to the Guru, which I still think is easily one of the best structured episodes of Book 2. Just to make it painfully clear, obviously a majority of this episode is fundamental to the story and under no definition could ever be seen as filler. Rather, I want to expand on that point of some of these crucial plot points happening a little too quickly because of the lack of filler. Take it from Mike and Brian themselves. Aang opening all of his chakras is purely an episode format thing, and ideally there'd be more time to expand on that. So again, there is a creative limitation that does a teeny bit limit the impact of this episode. But at the same time, this episode also functions as a bit of recap before the big Book 2 finale, with us also seeing what every single major player in the world is up to. Things like Sokka meeting up with their dad only to turn right around I think is the clearest example. It allows us to catch up on everything going on while not really changing the course of the story. But the really interesting stuff happens on Aang's side, as that recap is combined with the actual process of unlocking his chakras. Just like with the Ember Island players, it is a perfect and natural way to incorporate functional recap and, in this case, with reused animation. All of which brings me back to that point of good filler is filler you will never even think of as filler. Aang opening his chakras is not filler, but it has filler that is an overall value add. If you were to remove all of this recappy nature from the episode and it's just Katara getting captured, Toph learning metal bending, and Aang chatting to Guru Patik, that transitionary sense that this episode is trying to get across just wouldn't hit the same. In order to understand the Avatar state, lingering in those memories that is recap, I think is absolutely vital. And yes, I'll have to agree with Mike and Brian here. Had we spent more time with Aang wandering through these memories, I think the episode would have been even stronger, but alas, it was still very, very good. But outside of Ember Island players, I think the greatest examples of filler in Avatar is 1, the thing that made me create this video in the first place, the Tales of Ba Sing Se, and 2, Appa's Lost Days. I've made a whole video on Tales, so I'm not going to repeat everything here, but if you really think about it, the most not filler part of the episode is Momo sleeping in Appa's paw prints. The plot is about finding Appa again, so Appa being in Ba Sing Se is the most important part of that. Iroh's past is a close second, but everything else is pure filler, and that is brilliant. It shows us just a regular day of their lives to 1, contrast everything that led us here, and 2, to contrast everything that would immediately follow. Without Appa, we are briefly grounded and forced to think a whole lot more about who we are and where we stand. The episode does still have some good old low-stakes hijinks with Sokka, but the episode as a whole is an emotional journey alongside the main cast to show us sides of them we barely, if ever, see. It's the perfect example of how to do filler right, in the same way that Mythic Quest dropped that episode mid-season 1. If you know, you know. And the same goes for Appa's Lost Days. Plot-wise, you can remove this episode outright. Appa is captured, later we find him in Lake Laogai, Zuko frees him. That is it. That is the plot that we sort of need to know. But no, because right on the heels of the Tales of Ba Sing Se, we see a whole episode that might as well be called the Tale of Appa, because in the same way the Tales is a purely character-driven emotional roller coaster, Appa's story too is a series of very, very unfortunate events. It doesn't go quite as far as Primal in the sense that it is purely zero dialogue whatsoever, but obviously our protagonist Appa doesn't exactly say a lot. And actually, think about that for a second. This is a Nickelodeon show. The episode has like zero plot progression, and it's entirely made up of a silent animal suffering for like 20 minutes straight. Let that sink in. The most tragic part of this for me is that I know this is probably the thing that's going to get cut. Perhaps I'm speaking for myself here, but these two quote-unquote filler episodes back to back is the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Ba Sing Se, exactly because they evoke an emotional reaction. And what is art, if not an emotional reaction? The worst kinds of filler will make you feel either annoyed or perhaps even worse, just completely indifferent. But with this, Ba Sing Se is not just the climax of the season and a pivotal turning point in the core story of Avatar. It is also the location that evokes some of the strongest emotions. That is its purpose, to elevate the core plot and to make the series as a whole greater than the sum of its parts. So, pulling all of this together, nothing about filler is inherently bad. In fact, most of the time, it should be very good as it's the connective thread that ties together the actual plot. If your world feels shallow, boring, and artificial, if your viewer is not invested in the characters, those big climax moments and spectacle will be completely meaningless. Plenty of shows have done bombastic effects. Korra Book 2, later seasons of Game of Thrones, a familiar face on the channel, The Walking Dead, but the show, not the comic. Read the comic's really good. All of them have spectacle, but because the writing is between horrible and not great, none of that really means anything. In today's media sphere, and as we saw with Netflix's Avatar, I think that is the most important takeaway. Viewers won't switch off because there's a lot of talking, so long as the dialogue is good. They won't switch off if a character just goes for a walk and thinks, if the monologue is not in your face. And perhaps most importantly, they won't switch off if, God forbid, you give your characters flaws. What I think will make viewers switch off is 1, if you've cut all the stuff that makes that world, or 2, the filler you've added is just meaningless bloat. We are following this story because we want to see their stories, not just a collection of big battles. So my formula of good filler based on Avatar is this. Number 1, it provides a new type of conflict. It can be something as simple as baddie of the week, but it's through that baddie that we should explore some sort of new dimension of our core cast. If it's just a meaningless obstacle we fight, that is bloat and that is bad filler. If it's Jet who challenges Katara's feelings and Sokka's leadership, that is very good. If it's the whole runaway incident that leads into Sparky Boom Man, that leads into a whole bunch of character-driven drama, that is also very, very good. But conflict doesn't necessarily need to stem from just a human baddie. It can also be Aang letting the Avatar title go to his head on Kyoshi Island, which facilitates a different kind of conflict amongst the gang themselves. But very, very importantly, these characteristics shouldn't be just written in as these one-off meaningless bits of the story. That flaw or conflict must tie into more meaningful bits of the story to elevate the things that matter more. The chase establishes the somewhat conflict-ridden dynamic of Katara and Toph, but we then explore it more in the Tales of Ba Sing Se, and we then explore it even further in The Runaway. There is a constant thread connecting all of these events of varying importance. Which leads me into point numero 2. Just about every good bit of filler is about emotion, not spectacle or super meaningful challenge. Again, Appa's Last Days and the Tales of Ba Sing Se are the perfect examples. The conflict there isn't really conflict in the traditional sense. Again, going to bring up One Piece, but that's why I also think a lot of those filler arcs do not hit the same because they are not canon and so by default just don't have any stakes. I had a lot of fun watching them, but they are literally meaningless. So again, expand on these character traits that we already know, but just through a different lens. But thirdly, I do still think we need at least something to satisfy the monkey brain. So if we don't have any spectacle, I think visual variety in the setting is an absolute necessity. The Painted Lady, for example, is cool spiritual shenanigans on this desolate floating island thingy. It's not anything super vibrant or eye-catching, but it's unique. Even the Great Divide, that is a unique location. The pirates are, well, pirates first of all, which is also unique, but we also get the whole cool waterfall sequence and all that. Tales of Ba Sing Se has a long list of new visuals that we hadn't seen in the series, and I mean the Iroh tree is one of the most iconic shots in all of Avatar. Let me just ask you this, how many times in Avatar do we see reused locations? Exactly, basically not at all, and even with things like Omashu, it goes from Earth Kingdom rule to the Fire Nation, so even there, it does have variety. With these three things in mind, as long as you're given enough runtime, I think you can cook up some really rewarding side adventures that enrich the primary plots, and avoid just rushing through this bullet point list of major story beats. Unfortunately, I'm sure Netflix has a whole lot more retention data than me, and if it is really a data-driven decision, well, I might as well be a boomer screaming into the void because clearly short-form content is in much higher demand. And when I say short-form, I'm not actually talking about the runtime of the show, as that is basically the same as the animated show, but more so in the way that runtime is actually used with filler and pacing. To me, it does seem like just min-maxing retention. That said, it's not all bad. One of the greatest series of 2023 in my opinion was Frieren. And a whole lot of people, they're completely wrong of course, describe that show as just pure filler. No, like seriously, I've never seen anyone be that wrong. But clearly, there is still appreciation for these super slow, more down-to-earth shows in the mainstream, especially since right before that, we also had Vinland Saga Season 2. But anyway, all of this was a very long-winded way to say that filler is in no way a bad thing and is crucial for a story to be more than just a series of disconnected events. Just like in the real world, it's often that seemingly meaningless stuff in between that gives the story the heart for which it is loved for. When I think of like the camping trips I've been on, I don't really think about the activities we got into. The thing that I always remember the most are those filler conversations around the campfire. So in the case of Avatar, episodes like Tales being among many people's favorites, but also being largely just filler, is a perfect example of how much the world itself and the characters in it resonate with the audience. Did I just make a 30-ish minute long video that could just be summarized with, it's about the journey, not the destination? Yes, but it is about the journey. And I think for a little while, the journeys we see on screen might skew toward micromanaged spectacles more than authentic experiences. So, until that pendulum swings back, I think diving deeper into these misconstrued shortcomings is worthy of a small 30-minute journey. And that's the video. Turned out to be a little longer than I expected, but I really wanted to talk about the underappreciated value of filler and the tightrope you really have to walk to make it meaningful, especially having seen the Netflix version that mostly just removed it outright. Feels like I've been babbling about this stuff ever since live-action One Piece, so happy to have finally formalized those thoughts at least somewhat. Knowing me though, I'll probably end up returning to this again at some point. But anyway, with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, Dominic Kolb. I am so sorry if I butchered the name, but without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.